How you doing, fan bam? This is Chris Mizo here with another video about a direct comparison between two controllers that I really favor on PC. And the two controllers that I am exactly talking about are, I want to compare the 360 controller right next to the Xbox Series X controller. You could already see the big physical difference between the both of them. And I want to compare these two controllers for you if you're thinking about upgrading your controller or you're thinking about purchasing a controller for your PC. I know it is a big decision, especially if you're building a new PC and you don't know exactly which is the best to get. I will compare these very two controllers for you guys because this will really probably help narrow down exactly what you're looking for on a gaming controller for your PC. We all know that even for the most experienced PC gamers, they will tell you the same thing. There are certain games that you will need to use a controller on. And I'll show you exactly which controller, what I think personally is best. Make sure you stay tuned and watch the whole video to find out exactly which controller fits best for your needs. If you find this content very useful, make sure you don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you love the PCs, you love to talk about tech, make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button for more. Now let's get straight to it because I want to really compare these two controllers for you guys. The very first thing I would love to talk about is the design. The design is very different on the two. Even though they look pretty similar, they're really not all that similar. You can see the difference between the left stick to the right stick. The spacing between them two are different. Even the spacing for the button layout's a little bit different. And of course you got the triggers back here, the left trigger and the right trigger, and you got the left bumper and the right bumper, and they're both designed completely different as well. Of course you got 3 extra buttons up here. You got on the Xbox Series X controller, you got a Windows layout button, you got a options button, and it also has a share button compared to a back and start button, which was a lot more simpler to remember, of course, back then. The D-pad's quite different. You can see the configuration's a little bit different from it. Of course, the nice thing about the 360 controller that I do like is that you can clearly see the colors on the button layout compared to the Xbox Series X controller where you can't really see the colors. Of course, you got all black buttons here, but inside of it, you can actually see the different colors of what these buttons are supposed to be. But for the 360 controller, you have a clear indication of which color is which on it. Now moving on, I'm going to talk about ease of installation. Now the ease of installation, I'm going to talk about the 360 controller first. The 360 controller does require a RF adapter if you're using it wirelessly. If you are not using it wirelessly, it'll be a plug-and-play controller. Microsoft will recognize it right away, especially that it is a 360 controller and it's been around already, so you know all the drivers are up to date, and this does not require any firmware updates to it, so it is pretty easy to install. The RF adapter is a whole nother story. Now if you're trying to play it wirelessly, if you're not familiar how to install the RF adapter properly, make sure you go to the card above me because I can show you exactly how you do it. I know the installation for it is quite cumbersome, especially if it's a generic RF adapter. If you do have an Xbox 360 controller wireless, you do want a wireless RF adapter just like this one. I purchased it off eBay for about $9.99. It can be quite troublesome to get that radio frequency that you need for your Xbox 360 controller because it will typically come up as an unknown device, which is what most people run into. So the ease of access, it can be also quite difficult to install this controller as well. If you're using it through USB, all you have to do is plug this on top of the controller. It's a little bit older of a design as Xbox 360 has its own port. Xbox 360 does have its own port, so you just plug this right onto the top, just like this. And then the other end will just go into the PC, which is just typical USB-A. And this will just plug right in and the PC should recognize it right away. Also, another thing I gotta mention is when you do purchase any of these controllers, whether it's 360 or Xbox Series X controller, they do not come with rechargeable batteries, that you do have to purchase them separate. And that's always been a thing about Microsoft. About the Xbox Series X controller, it does require a more universal design compared to the older Xbox 360 peripheral design, to where it was only designed for Xbox 360 to use that specific USB, because Xbox Series X uses more of a conventional design to where you can use USB-C to USB-A, meaning you just need to cord something similar to this, just the USB-C side, and it just goes onto the top of the Xbox Series X controller just like this. And of course USB-A just goes into the USB port of your PC. When you plug this into your Xbox Series X controller and plug it directly to your PC, Microsoft Windows should recognize it right away, and it shouldn't have any issues playing it. Of course, if you're trying to play it wirelessly, it does require Bluetooth. If your PC does not have Bluetooth, then it requires you to have a Bluetooth dongle or a Bluetooth adapter, and then it will work with the Xbox Series X controller. The installation of this does require one more step, but I still feel like it's a little bit more easier, a little bit more user-friendly in terms of installation compared to the 360 design, which is turning more into a legacy device now. And of course, if you do not know exactly how to install this controller, you can just click the card above my head and I will show you exactly how to install this controller properly, to where you should be able to function this controller even outside of Steam. That's how you'll know a controller works properly, if it works outside of Steam. When you press left trigger and right trigger, it does have a little resistance, and it feels nice and smooth. The right button and left button work really well. They respond pretty smooth. Now the D-pad, I never really liked the design of D-pads on a 360 controller, just because it felt too circular. It was terrible like during fighting games. Overall design of the button layout has been really well designed and comfortable. Xbox Series X controller, when this fits in your hand, it almost has grippish texture on the back of the Xbox Series X controller, and it has a grippish texture too on the right trigger and the left trigger of this controller. Another thing about it is when you hit left button and the right button, you can also, it just kind of very little resistance. It's just like another button. The joysticks actually feel a little bit weaker compared to the 360's controller. 360's controller has a little resistance when you're using the joysticks, so it feels like that you're getting the response you want. When you use the Xbox Series X controller, it does feel a little bit more loose. It feels like it's not going to last just like how the 360 controller will. But of course, I will update you guys if my joysticks end up failing on me, but I haven't had that issue quite yet, and it seems like it has been working quite well. The buttons have been really smooth, and I feel like the response I'm getting from when I hit the buttons seems to be a little bit quicker, maybe because Bluetooth moves a little bit faster than radio frequency, but it does respond a little bit quicker from what I noticed. 3 extra buttons, unless you design them to, on the Xbox accessory app in the Microsoft Store. Now the D-pad, I feel, is a better design compared to the 360's or circle design, to where it felt more terrible. But it actually clicks when you press the D-pad on the Xbox Series X controller. I feel like the spacing between the buttons on the Xbox Series controller feel quite nice. They're not as bulky as it was on the Xbox 360 controller. Everything feels almost pretty tight when you actually feel the difference between the controllers. 360's controller feels a little bit more plasticky when you touch their buttons. The only things that really feel plastic on the Xbox Series X controller are the D-pad and the button layouts for A, B, X, and Y. So the reliability of these two controllers, I gotta say, with the 360 controller, of course, it's lasted me for about 8 years so far, and it's still running. It's still a champion. I'll probably still hold on to this controller as a backup controller if anything happens to my Xbox Series X controller, but it does not have any issues. Of course, it feels more like it does feel like more like a toy when you're holding this thing, and I probably dropped this so many times on a hardwood floor and it's still okay. Yeah, I gotta say, this has been designed very well and made very well. Now the Xbox Series X controller, I can't really say anything about the reliability just yet, but I'm kind of nervous about these joysticks. I'm afraid that they'll end up drifting eventually. I'll give you an update on it if that actually happens. But other than that, other than the joysticks, I feel like everything else on this controller feels just as well. Another thing I gotta mention too is on the back of the design, of course, of the Xbox Series X controller. It's more flush. You don't have to worry about this thing at all. You don't have to worry about this thing popping out or anything like that. You don't have to worry about any bulkiness sticking out of this controller. Whereas the 360 controller, you did have this bulk here. You did have this little bulk here right in the between it for a rechargeable battery. And usually you get these rechargeable batteries pretty cheap, especially now that it's out of date. But it never interferes with actually holding it, but I'll get to that. But the only thing is, when you're actually controlling with this, sometimes this battery does pop out. And the thing about this this battery, sometimes it'll get like a little, kind of like a little sag here. And again, this is 8 years worth of dropping on the floor, but you get a little bit of sag from the batteries on this, and that's just from use. Of course, the newer design is not like that, which is a big improvement design on Microsoft's side. Now I'm going to talk more about customization, and for the Xbox 360 controller, there's very little to customize on this thing. You could customize the back button, but typically that's the escape key, or sometimes the start is the escape key to where it pulls up that menu. You can customize that back button, but that's practically it. For the Xbox Series X controller, you can customize it a little bit more. It does have a little bit more buttons, but not by much. You can customize 3 different buttons. Typically that menu button is the escape key, so you only have 1 extra button to really customize. So Xbox Series X barely wins on top of that. Now I want to talk to you about the feel of the controllers, the size of it. Now on the Xbox 360 controller, when you're grabbing it, because of this battery, you have to grab it like this, so it does feel it's a little bit more bulkier, and it is a more bulkier controller. So when you're playing it, and my hands are large hands, so when I am playing it, it can feel a little bit cramped playing on this thing, just because of the bulkiness of the 360 controller. Now when you're moving the joysticks and everything, that feels okay, but you can actually feel yourself holding the 2 sides of the controller just like this. You can actually feel it after a while. And I played with both of these for a couple hours to compare exactly the difference between the two, and you could really notice the difference, especially when you're holding it. And it does feel a little bit more of an outdated design when you do hold this 360 controller. It is very noticeable, it is. But for the Xbox Series X controller, and another thing too is because of the way you grip it, you have to be careful not to hit that battery release button up on the top, which is right up there. You got to make sure you be careful, don't hit that, because then your battery just pops right out. Now with the Xbox Series X controller, it's more flush. It feels way more comfortable, I gotta tell you that right off the bat. And I gotta say, Xbox Series X controller, the spacing is really well. It's almost like perfectly spaced. You can feel way more comfortable playing a game for hours on this, because your hands will start to cramp up, especially if you're playing a 360 controller, at least for like 15 to 20 minutes. When you're holding this thing, it's almost natural. It almost feels natural. It just forms through your hands. So Xbox Series X wins this side of things hands down. As you can see, the Xbox Series X controller is at 9.9 ounces, and it tends to feel back heavy because of exactly where the batteries are located. It's directly in the bag, so a lot of the weight is towards the center of this controller. You'll naturally drift down when you're using this controller after playing for about 10 minutes or so. Now the Xbox Series X controller, it is a little bit more heavier, about 0.2 ounces heavier, but it does feel way more comfortable playing with it just because it feels a lot more well balanced. It is not back heavy where the batteries are located. It actually feels equally balanced compared to a Xbox 360 controller to where it felt back heavy. For me, I gotta say the Xbox Series X controller is a much better design. It's way more comfortable to use on PC in my personal opinion. Of course, you can look over everything that I categorized and see what you feel is best for yourself. But I feel, in my opinion, the Xbox Series X controller is a true successor of Xbox 360's controller. If you found this content very useful, make sure you don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And also, if you want more content just like this, make sure you go down and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit the notification bell. And if you want all the newest updates, make sure you follow my Twitter handle right here. So guys, let me know what you think, in your opinion, what controller you like best, especially if you experience both. Make sure you put it down in the comments down below and let me know what kind of controller you're thinking of purchasing for your PC. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is Chris Mizo signing out.